All right, this is Genesis 33, and we left off with Jacob getting a limp on the journey home. He knew that Esau was coming. He knew that he needed to face him. And the pivotal chapters in his life are 28, Stairway to Heaven, and 32, Limp by God. And heaven's touch changed this man. Now I want to show you some things about how that touch can be recognized, or how you see the transformation. So face to face with Esau, he's facing a conflict that was part of his past, and he was going to have to face it with his limp, with his God, with the changes of character that God had already been doing in the transformation. We have to face the past if we're going to see the changes of the future come into our lives. You don't bury your past, you recognize it and reckon it. And the past burdens, the past hindrances, those things have to be reckoned with before you can move on. What's interesting to me is that during the many years away, God's material favor fell on Jacob. I mean, he left basically with a staff and came back with a flock. And with an entire, multiple tents, wives, children out the yazoo, he's got everything. Married 2 wives, fathered children by them and by concubines. You're coming back with 11 sons and 2 daughters, 5 golden rings and a partridge in a pear tree. The guy's got everything. But boxed in by the trickery of Laban, his uncle, and a rising tide of resistance, Jacob found himself in need of a home. And he knew it was time to go. What would the future hold? Well, his future was being built on 3 preceding acts. And the 3 preceding acts are these. Look at 31:3, and you'll remember obedience. God told Jacob to go home. So his arrival back is based on him obeying God. The Lord said, return to the land of your fathers. It's also based on cooperation, because chapter 31, verse 16 said that Jacob had the cooperation and blessing of his wives. Yes, we get it. Papa sold us off. We're going to head home. But he had peace. Remember? They had settled it by building that big monument as a place of peace. So let's just say it this way. Jacob's next phase, that last chapter has been closed by God before he opens the new chapter. It's true, the new chapter of his life is going back and dealing with an old problem. A guy who only knew him before. Now, there's a couple of preparations that went on in his life. He met an angel. He met Laban. He wrestled. All that happened before he met Esau. And what's interesting is God showed up. He found out 400 people were coming. He prayed. And then, here's what I want you to get out of that limp. God broke his stride. He no longer had a self-stride. God picked a fight with Jacob so that he would recognize his dependence on God. And the longer the past sin is buried, the more painful the wrestling match to surrender that past sin. The longer your resistance to God has been buried, the more painful the surrender of it will be. So let's talk about a time to face the past. From their birth, Esau and Jacob were completely different. One guy's an outdoors sportsman. He goes after gazelles and ibex. And he's a man of the dirt, gritty from the field. He's the old Marlboro man of yesteryear, You can just see him kind of coming back on his horse, coming in. And Jacob, on the other hand, is a homebody. He likes mind games. He doesn't want to chase animals. He'd rather get into some of the manipulative mind games. And he was a mama's boy. But Esau only knew the old Jacob. Jacob had been changed by God. So I want to talk to you about some marks of how you can see God's change, okay? I'm going to pick out 8 marks of change in chapter 33. You might have a different number. It's okay with me. I'm just giving you the ones that I see. Let's talk about 8 marks of God's work of change in you. Esau is about to encounter an entirely different Jacob because God showed up and left a mark on him that changed him. The first mark is humility. And I see that in verses 1 to 3. Humility. He was humbled, he was vulnerable, he wasn't arrogant, he wasn't presumptive. Then Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 maids. He put the maids and their children in front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph he put last. But he himself passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. Now, it's interesting. A present to Esau without the presentation of humility probably wouldn't work. So Esau's not on a shopping spree. He needs to see something changed in Jacob to release the bad feeling that he had been cheated. What does he do? Jacob comes out and lays himself down in front of him 7 times. What would that say to Esau? Minimally, it would say he's scared to death. But if Esau's heart had also changed in that 20 years, it may suggest to him that Jacob must be different than the Jacob I knew before. It's the behavior of the new Jacob that marked, the humble behavior of Jacob that marked the way Esau saw him. You're going to run into people that knew the old you. And the way that you're going to demonstrate the new you is not by walking in and saying, by the way, I'm a Christian, read my t-shirt. You're going to come in with humility, and that's one of the marks that will help people to hear you. A second one is what I call thirst in verse 4. Thirst. He was a man who thirsted for connection. What I mean by that is, rather than the guy who steals your blessing and takes your spot in the family, he's a guy who wants to be connected to the family. He hungers or thirsts to be connected. Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. The fruits that fell pulled them back to the family tree. All of a sudden, they're in a situation where the stage for forgiveness has been set. The connection is real. Both of them apparently feel a need to be connected to each other. It's been 20 years since Dad died. They've been out on their own. I know that for some of you, you've barely gotten out of your home, so you don't feel this yet. But your brothers and sisters are your connection when your parents are gone. They're the connection to the gene pool of life. That's how you got here. And in fact, you all have funny stories that you can tell about each other that no one else would really understand. There are certain things that happen in a home that just make you peculiar to that family. So there's the moment of connection. One of the things that you want to stop and do, though, is also see in verse 5 thankfulness. Look at the thankfulness. He was now a man who saw God as the giver rather than himself as the taker. See, clever people think they're taking. Thankful people see God giving. And he lifted up his eyes. He saw the women and children and said, "Who are these with you?" So he said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Not, "Hey, haven't I done well for myself? There's none of that in his voice. Jacob claimed no ownership or ability apart from the blessing of God. He understood that it was not his clever nature. It was God's good hand, and that's how he got blessed. So I see him as humble. I see him as thirsting for relationship. I see him as thankful. Look at verse 6 and 7 and put a word to this. Then the maids came near with their children. They bowed down. What's a word you could put on this? Respect. Respectful. That's what I see. I say he was a man that expected and taught respect. How do I know Jacob was respectful? Because he taught his children to respect. And rather than some kind of trickster who was trying to be clever, he taught his children a pattern of respect, and it became obvious. In verse 7, Leah likewise came near with her children. They bowed down. And afterward, Joseph came near with Rachel, and they bowed down. Jacob showed no respect for the position of his father. Back when? The old before Jacob. He thought getting a birthright and setting a cunning trap, that was all there was to life. Now he's bowing down before Esau, and his older brother would see that he taught respect to those in his household. And that makes a big difference. When people see that you're exuding respect, you get respect by giving respect. And verses 8 through, I'm going to say all the way down to say 11, I think is a good place to mark it. I use the word beholden. This is an old English word. It might not be one you use a lot. Beholden. He was a man who needed to pay his past debt. He recognized he was a debtor. So it says, and he, or Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company, the flocks and servants you sent ahead of you, which I have met?" And Jacob said, "To find favor in your sight, my lord." And Esau said, "I have plenty, my brother. Let what you have be your own." Jacob said, "No, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then take my present from my hand, for I see your face as one who sees the face of God, and you have received me favorably." What is he saying? What does verse 10 mean? I see your face as the face of God. What does that mean? I see you as being gracious to me when I don't deserve it, and that's how I see God. You're a guy who shows me grace like God does. Please take my gift which I brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have plenty. Thus he urged him, and he took it. Forgiveness by Esau was essential to Esau's growth and development, but failure to forgive places all the power in the hands of the one that gave us the wound. If you don't forgive somebody else, you're giving them all the power over your life. You're creating a victim out of yourself. You don't stop being a victim until you don't let yourself be a victim anymore. You have to release bitterness to regain freedom. And Esau apparently has done that. Now, something else I want to say about Jacob. In verses 12 to 14, he's unselfish. Jacob the trickster is unselfish. Remember, he's not really Jacob anymore, he's Israel. He's the man with the limp. He was a man that learned to lead with the needs of other people in mind rather than care only for himself. And where do I get that in 12 to 14? Listen, it says, "Then Esau said, 'Let us take our journey and go, and I will go before you.' But he said, 'My Lord knows the children are frail, and the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me. And if they are driven hard one day, all the flocks will die. Please let my Lord pass on before his servant, and I will proceed at my leisure, according to the pace of the cattle that are set before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord at Seir.'" He says, "I understand why you want me to go with you, but I now have to think about my kids, and I have to think about the young animals." And all of a sudden, Jacob starts coming out and is explaining to the woodsman hunter what animals are like. Now, there's irony here. But he's also communicating something to Esau. What's he communicating to him? My mind's not just on what's good for me. I have a flock to care for. I'm now an elder of a flock, and I need to be concerned about where they're at. That's just not the Jacob that left. That Jacob that left cared about nothing but himself. This Jacob is consumed with how everybody else in the flock is going to, and the weakest among them become his concern and care. Now, the other thing I think is that he's responsible. I see that in verse 15. He's responsible. He was a man that took responsibility for his own problems rather than seeking somebody else's influence or position to care for the need. Esau said, "Please let me leave with you some of the people who are with me." But he said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." Jacob started his life trying to get from Esau what was not his own. But by now, Jacob's taking full responsibility for the needs of the flock. He's asking nothing from his brother but relationship and blessing. He doesn't need more from Esau. This is ironic because the last time they left, he was stealing from Esau. Now he's saying, "No, I don't need anything from you. I'm fine. Thank you for your help." And the last one, I think that is a mark of transformation, is in verses 16 through 20, and I call this worshipful. He's worshipful. I get that because it says, "So Esau returned that day on the way to Seir. Jacob journeyed to Sukkot and built for himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore the place is called Sukkot." Sukkot means booths. That's what it means. Lean-tos or sheds. Now Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram and camped before the city. He bought the piece of land where he had pitched his tent from the hand of the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. Then he erected there an altar, and he called it El Elohi Yisrael. El is God, Elohi, the God of Yisrael. El is not only God, but it's also the strong one. So God, the strength of Israel, or God, the God of Israel. What's interesting to me is that he comes, and at the end of the story, God preserves his life, and he stops, and he makes a spot for worship. He really gets the idea that God is transforming his life. All right. Everybody here, I think, agrees, because you've been following along the story today, that Jacob is not the guy he was when he left. He's an incredible, different guy. The problem is that his children have seen Jacob in the growing process. I'm trying to find the right way to explain this. If my children could see me where I end, that would be fine, but they're not. They see me as I'm growing to be what I'm supposed to be. Does that make sense? And as a result, some days I'm not what I'm supposed to be, because I'm not there yet. I'm in the process of transformation. So in the arc of doing right and wrong, my children are seeing that. The next story becomes a very important story about, although Jacob's life was changing, Jacob already had some children, and not all the children had a hunger that matched his. I want to talk about a young lady who becomes the prodigal daughter. There is a prodigal son story in the New Testament. This is the prodigal daughter story. For some of you, you could paint your picture in there. For others, it's a great story to recognize in the lives of some of your friends. Okay? Don't miss 34. If you have been reading along in the Old Testament, like blah, 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 old stuff for dead Jews, this one's gonna sing for you. Because the story of Dinah, or Dinah, however it's said, it's Dinah in Hebrew. The story of Dinah is a very powerful, important story. I want to talk about, in 34, sources of pain for the believer. I want you to see that even among a transformed Jacob, there was an untransformed daughter. How many of you know saved parents with unsaved kids? We've all seen this, okay? I want you to see, framed in 34, let me give you a principle for this. Even though God completely changes me, I'm still going to experience heartbreak because of other people who aren't changed. In other words, God is changing, transforming me, but I'm still in a world of people that I love that aren't transformed. And I'm going to go through pain. How many of you have been embarrassed by the sin of somebody close to you? Somebody else sinned and you were like mortified. Brother, sister, parent. See, one of the problems with a parent walks out on the other parent, okay? And it's hard enough to face all of the pain of that situation, but you're also embarrassed that somehow they got in front of all their friends, said they would live together until death do they part, and they lied. Or they didn't fulfill it, or they whatever. So you have all these feelings about it. I want you to see the traps that are set up. These are some tough things. Here's a girl. Can everybody understand how to use this in a youth group? Look at verse 1. Tell me what you can do with this verse. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. Does everybody get it? You all know exactly what she's about? The believer's child is hungry to see who? The world. She wants to go beyond the stupid little fence of her nice little Christian family. She wants to see the cool stuff that's out there. She hungers to get out there, take a little walk on the wild side, sow some wild oats. So in the beginning, in verse 1, I see a hunger. What's the hunger? She has a hunger to see people who live on the other side of the tracks. Did anybody ever have that hunger? Anybody ever just want to know what that whole sinful life thing is all about? Come on, every movie glorifies the sinner. You never get the movie where the good girl or the good guy, the moral one is the cool one. The cool one's always the one with the motorcycle who's, running around doing bad stuff. Hollywood glorifies the world system. And then they kill themselves because they can barely stand the world that they create. Jacob wanted to follow God, but he found it nearly impossible to keep his children from wandering into the world's influences. Dinah went into the world believing she was insulated with some kind of protection. Listen, one of the greatest mistakes you're going to run into with Christian kids, that is kids of Christian homes, is they somehow think that they can cruise right through the world system and not be touched by it. Oh, I can hang out with a bunch of sinners and nothing bad's going to happen to me. Don't you believe it for a minute. Let me go to a third source of pain that comes up in Jacob's life. And this is a third, you know, when you look at these, there are a lot of things, but these are sources of pain for a believer. Look at this one. In verses 3 and 4, she gets used. A third source of pain for the believer is that they need to be prepared for the reality that the world warms to us when we offer something they wanted, and then when they get it, we've been used. Spiritually dead men are self-serving to the extreme. That's what they are. Some believers really believe their unbelieving friends want to give them some kind of advance in their journey to the truth. They don't. Throughout history, we can see examples after example. Look, whenever Hollywood makes a movie on the Bible, it's never going to be more about the Bible. It's going to be more about the values of Hollywood. That's what it's going to be about. Stop looking for Christian values to come out in the movie theater. That's not where you find Christian values to begin with. Most people go to the movie theater to enjoy the movie. So in the case of Shechem, the unbeliever had no idea that God had a standard of separation for the believer. He didn't know. He's not going, oh, I can't sleep with her because she is of the Hebrews. Well, he doesn't even know about the Hebrews and he doesn't care. The unbeliever doesn't think that God has some standard. He saw what he wanted. He took what he wanted. Look at verse 3 and 4. This is really interesting how, when you zero in on the circumstance, how the changes take place. He was deeply attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. That would be after he raped her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor and said, "Get me this young girl for a wife." So he sampled the goods first, then went to his dad and said, "I like it, and I want her." And you know what he never thinks of? Her. She's a piece of meat. That's what this is. Now, he has some tender words for her, but I can tell you what the tender words were angled toward. There's verses 5, 6, and 7. I put the word frustration on. Another source of pain is the reality that when we may not be immediately powerful enough to solve a situation our loved ones get themselves into. So look at Jacob's little shot here. It says, Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter, but his sons were with his livestock in the field. So Jacob kept silent until they came in. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. Now the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved, and they were very angry because Shechem, had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not to be done. Notice he says it's in Israel, which means this is written down later. And so somebody's actually going back and dating this. So since the writer is going to be Moses, he's going to see this as the promised land. And because it's inside that land, he's going to call it by the name Israel. Because this is much, much later. It's being written down much after it happened. Okay? Don't forget, the version of the story you're reading is the version God communicated to Moses hundreds of years after the events. Okay? Now, what's interesting is Jacob had to face the fact that wrong was being perpetrated, but he was in no position to deal with it when he was stuck there by himself. Jacob was depressed about what he couldn't do. He needed to stop by the nearest pharmacy. He was hurting. There's no greater frustration that I know of in life than watching your child go the wrong way and knowing you can't fix it. You can't do anything with it. Can I just tell you, while the boys were out in the field, and Jacob was there, can I just tell you, I don't think he was sleeping. I think after his daughter came home, I think after the story reaches him is how I should say it. After the story reaches him, I don't think he's in any way sleeping. I think he is sleepless. I think he's upset. I think he's depressed. And the longest nights are the ones when a child is in pain and you can't take the pain away from the child. there's a compromise here in verses 8 through 12. Compromise. The problem is that there is, the biblical values are not the source of the tension and pain. The compromise in those values are. So I want you to see, it says, Hamor spoke with them, verse 8, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us. Give your daughters to us and our daughters for yourselves. Thus you shall live with us, and the land shall be open before you. Live and trade in it and acquire property in it. Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, if I find favor in your sight, then I will give you whatever you say to me. Ask me ever so much bridal payment and gift, and I will give according to as you say. But give me the girl in marriage. Guys, there are many times as a Bible teacher, I offer warnings about enticing trends that are drawing believers in by the dozens. Sometimes we seem cranky. Sometimes believers sound anti-everything. But here's the thing. That's not really the case. We live a wonderful life. We have all kinds of material comforts. We are not downtrodden in the earth. I'm not walking around with this, oh, it's such a burden to be a Christian. The problem is, pressure can be a positive tool in God's hand, but it can also be a negative tool. And I want you to see, add to the constant call of the unbiblical decision for short-term gains, we have to admit it's easy for us to lose the sight of real objectives that God has for our lives. It's easy. As believers, we can go, I've lost track of what God wants for me. You know what? I want you to look at verse 8 for a second. Basically, this is what the dad was saying. My son wants this, so I'm coming to you. That's what he says. Now, beneath that statement are at least 3 malformed presuppositions. First, my son is mature enough to make good choices. That's demonstrated as false since he abducted and raped a girl. So let's not give too much to your son for knowing what he wants, because he doesn't seem to be able to control impulses all that well. But that's not the only one. Second, the other presupposition is my son's feelings are all that really matter. See, in this decision, there is no mention of Dinah's desires or family standards. The only thing that's mentioned is my son wants this. How do you suppose the son got that way? Can I make the argument from the parents? They gave him everything, and therefore he expects everything. By the way, he would be no prince to marry. He may be a prince in his village, but he's not going to be a prince to marry. The third thing I notice, it's a presupposition, but everybody should care about what my son desires. He's walking around under the impression, well, if my son wants it, everybody in this room should care about it. Well, I don't really care if your son wants it. How about that? The other thing is that you see that he says, live with us. In this way, you can acquire property in verses 9 and 10. But look closer at what he's saying. What Hamor is saying is this. My son has raped your daughter and is holding her captive, but we really think this can work out well for you. I mean, come on, guys. Does anybody see how ludicrous this is? Yes, we did rape her, and yes, we're holding her in the basement, but we're really thinking of you. No, not so much. He's attempting to connive and trick, but here's the problem. He doesn't know Jacob. Jacob knows a few things about manipulating. Jacob may be a believer, and Jacob may not be a manipulator anymore, but Jacob knows how to do it. And by the way, Jacob has been to the Laban school of used camel salesman manipulation. He's had his paycheck changed 10 times and his wife swapped right on the honeymoon. He has been with some really good guys. This guy isn't that good. So, Jacob's past is littered with a conniving mom, a fickle uncle. He's got a little experience. Hamor's trying to get God's man to compromise because it's going to benefit Hamor and his people, not because it's going to be good for Jacob. So listen to this. He shares with the people of his own clan. Listen to verse 20. So Hamor said, Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of their own city and spoke to the men of their own city, saying, these men are friendly with us. Let them live in the land and trade in it. For behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters in marriage and give our daughters to them. Only on this condition the men will consent to live with us, to become one people, that every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock and their property and all their animals be ours? Only let us consent to them, and they will live with us. I want you to notice, what would be the underlying reason, if you were sitting at the gate, that you would agree to be circumcised and let them become part of your community?
These guys have a lot of stuff.
They got a lot of stuff. They got good stuff, and we're going to get their stuff. So everything they're saying to Jacob about how this is going to work out well for you is nonsense. Cut to the place where they're alone in the room and they believe it's all going to be about them. They're not saying we will both benefit from this. They're saying, look at what we're going to get. That's the point. The world has no long-term interest in the objectives of the believer. We need to be wise, not just cynical and negative. We have to be able to see the truth through their shiny teeth and their slick displays. Okay, now, I want you to pick up on 13 to 29 on the poor choices. These are my two words, poor choices. 13 to 29. One of the pains that a believer goes through it's a very significant source, are the poor choices of people around us. Even when we can understand why they made them, they're going to make poor choices and it's going to hurt us. Let me just be clear on what I'm doing here. Jacob is going through pain because he's watching others make poor choices. Now let's look at who the others are. It says, Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor with deceit. Circle deceit. Jacob, who has been changed and transformed from being a manipulator, has now raised an entire team of manipulators. And it's going to break his heart. And they were deceitful because he had defiled Dinah, their sister. By the way, does it sound like they had a good reason to do this? It really does. If that was my sister, I'd want to break the guy's legs. It's not that I don't understand the feeling, it's that what the action is wrong. And it's wrong no matter why you do it. It's still wrong. There is a right way to deal with this and a wrong way. By the way, when we get to the law, there's a right way to solve this situation without anybody getting a broken leg. And the problem is that they don't use any of the right ways to do it. But later on in the law, this story will be referenced so that you understand why the law is structured the way it is. Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father with deceit. Verse 14, they said to him, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for they would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we consent to you. If you will become like us, in that every male of you be circumcised, then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters for ourselves, and we will live with you and become one people. But if you will not listen to us to be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and go. Now their words seemed reasonable to Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. The young man did not delay to do the thing, because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. Now he was more respected than all the household of his father. Would you stop and look at that verse? Look at verse 19. The guy was a rapist and an abductor, and he was more respected than all the other people in the family. Can anybody tell me what the rest of the family must have been like? What were they doing? Chopping up children? I mean, come on. What exactly do you have to do to be worse than a rapist and abductor? Verse 24 says, all who went out of the gate of the city listened to Hamor, to his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised. All who went out of the gate of the city. Verse 25, now it came about on the third day, they were in pain that two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came upon the city unawares and killed every male. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went forth. Jacob's sons came upon the slain and looted the city, because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks, their herds, their donkeys, and all that was in their city, and that which was in the field, and they captured and looted all their wealth and all their little ones and all their wives, even all that was in the houses. Now look, Guys, we can certainly recognize and understand the feelings of Dinah's brothers. We even agree biblically that she was held captive and that was completely wrong. She was raped and that was completely wrong. And the people of the land were trying to negotiate a compromise that called for Jacob's family to violate what the Word of God told them to be, and that was wrong. We get it. The problem wasn't the objective of the boys. The problem was the method. They used trickery right out of the playbook of their father. They used wrong to do right. Listen to me, you don't use wrong to do right. You don't use wrong to do right. The ends don't justify the means, ever. That might seem reasonable in a world without God, but it's never reasonable in response to his moving anything. Here's the thing, what should they have done? Tell me what they should have done. Let's go past what they did. What should they have done? They should have stopped and built an altar at Bethel and cried out to God on behalf of their sister. Waited for an explanation. By the way, God might have told them to go kill them all. We don't know what God would have said because they never gave him the chance. Look, I'm not against you having devices in your life that make your life easy. I am against the fact that an awful lot of people whip out one of these instead of asking God how to pay for something. As long as you already have a method to do it, you never stop to ask God because you already have one. And some people are spending money they don't have rather than calling on God to provide. And they're missing out on God's provision, and he would have provided for them, but instead they're running up debts. Stop. All they had to do was stop and actually ask God what to do. Now, I want to stop here for a moment, and I want to mention something to you. I want to read something to you that comes from the 1960s, and you're going to sit here and go, why? That was the Dark Ages. And I'm going to tell you because it has everything to do with your education. The textbooks of your education were written from a certain perspective. The book was called Situational Ethics. It was an ethical theory promoted in the 1960s by Joseph Fletcher, an American Episcopal priest. He taught Christian ethics at Episcopal Divinity School, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and at Harvard Divinity School, 1944 to 1970. He was the first professor of medical ethics at the University of Virginia and co-founded the program in biology and society there. He retired from teaching in 1977. In 1974, the American Humanist Association named him Humanist of the Year. He was a priest. Okay? He served as president of the Euthanasia Society of America, later renamed the Society for the Right to Die, from 1974 to 76. He was also a member of the American Eugenics Society and the Association for Voluntary Sterilization. This guy had death written all over him. Now, the reason I'm reading this is this. The theory Fletcher promoted is based on the underlying moral principle espoused by theologian Paul Tillich that love is the ultimate law. You're going to see that phrase, love is the ultimate law. By the way, it's not true. The outworking of the idea is that one can set aside moral absolutes in certain situations if it doesn't serve love well. In other words, love trumps morality. So, it stands opposed to legalism, and it's kind of a middle road. And this is what he said. Fletcher outlined his theory in 10 principles. Listen for a second. 4 presuppositions and 6 fundamental principles. Listen to the presuppositions. Number 1, pragmatism. The course of action chosen must be practical and able to work. Number 2 is relativism. All situations are morally relative. That's a presupposition. Is that true? Are all situations morally relative? Are some things right and some things wrong always? He doesn't believe that. He believes all situations are morally relative. Then the third one, positivism. We should freely choose to show love as described in his idea of love. Fourth, personalism. A legalist thinks people should work to laws. A situation ethicist believes that laws are subject to the benefit of the people. In other words, don't make the law bigger than people. And they'll use things like, well, the Son of Man came as Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath does not lord over the Son of Man, as if you're Jesus, okay? You're not Jesus. I mean, that's why I don't do WWJD. It's not what would Jesus do. It's what did Jesus tell me to do. I'm not Jesus, okay? So now, here are the fundamental the propositions of how you do this situational ethics. And then I'll bring it back to something that makes sense to you. Only one thing is intrinsically good, according to Fletcher, and that's love, nothing else. Number two, the ruling norm of Christian decision is love, nothing else. Number three, love and justice are the same. For justice is love distributed, nothing else. Number four, love wills the neighbor's good, whether we like him or not. Number five, only the end justifies the means, nothing else. Number six, love's decisions are situationally derived, not prescriptively. Here's what he's saying. What he's saying is, and by the way, he's the foundation of the social science curriculum of virtually every school, every public school across the land. Situational ethics is the rule of America now. It says there's nothing really right or wrong. It depends on the situation. So if you walk in, I guarantee you, you walk into the local high school and you say, hand out a flyer and say, true or false, it is always wrong to steal. What do you expect to get back in overwhelming numbers? False. It's only wrong to steal if my kids aren't starving. Do you understand why stealing, if your kids are starving, is wrong? You're a Christian. Tell me why it's wrong. My kids are starving. I'm going to stand by and watch my kids starve?
It's wrong because God says it's wrong. He never gave an opportunity that says, oh, except in this case. He just said it's wrong.
Okay, because he didn't say I had a way of getting out of it, I don't get out of it. How many of you could live with being wrong with God so that your kid could eat when they were hungry? You think you could? I think most all of us could. And here's the truth. Situational ethics leaves out one thing, that God is personally involved in our lives. There's the other answer, rather than steal, is seek God, who owns everything. When William Bradford's men bowed their knees, they crashed into the corn underneath the hut. They didn't know it was there. They didn't earn it. And they don't know how it got there. They only know that God provided it when they were hungry and bowed in prayer. What does that tell you? It tells you that God has more options than the ones you see. So the month might look small, might look large, and the money might look small. But the fact of the matter is, the month can look bigger than the money because God is bigger than both. Without God, it's easy to become a situational ethicist. So here's the thing. Tell me you don't see, is there anybody else in this room that would have liked to shoot these boys for raping the sister? You don't get enraged at that? You abducted my sister and raped her. What do you think? You're going to walk out of the room? I'm going to kill you dead. But there's another option. The other option is I'm going to bow before the Lord and get his instructions on what to do in this heinous crime. I'm going to seek God. You know why? Because the enemy destroys people. But the enemy will back off if he realizes that all it's doing is yielding praise to God. What if Jacob and all the boys went together to Bethel? What if they had laid down before God on the stone at Bethel and said, God, you are the God of Jacob. You are the God who has met me before. You are the God who, wait for it, connects heaven and earth. And my daughter might be held captive, but there's more to this than is just flesh. What about that? Then the story changes. I want you to understand something. Love and law run opposite each other. Love and justice run opposite each other. You want justice, you don't want love. You want love, you don't want justice. And no believer denies the necessity of love in all situations, but the whole theory rests on this world being the real world. That's the problem. Love not based on fixed truths is not love at all. Okay? Let's do it this way. Let me just kick around this idea. Let's say, Zoe, we're going to send you on a cruise, okay? You're on a cruise, and you get the second day out on your cruise, and this very handsome young man comes over, and he starts explaining to you his life story, and you really hit it off. I mean, 7 nights of the cruise, and 7 out of 7 of them, he's pulling out your chair. You're having a lovely meal together. He's explained to you that he is this lonely man who is looking for someone to go through life with, and everything he says just lines up beautifully with where you are. And you're really starting to feel in your heart like, you know, I'm really tugged. I could really be loving this guy. And at the end of the cruise, you get off the cruise, and as you get off the gangplank, you see that he runs down into the arms of his wife, and he's actually a shoe salesman from Hoboken, New Jersey, and everything he told you about his life was a lie. Love dissipates when it's not based on truth. So, at the foundation, it's not love. At the foundation, it's truth with love sitting on top of it. The foundation of the Christian life is not love, it's truth. Love not based on truth isn't love at all. That's going to be an incredibly important truth throughout Scripture, because you're going to have people that try to tell you, don't die for truth, die for love. Love not rooted in truth isn't love. It's infatuation. Okay? It's only real if he's telling the truth. If he's not telling the truth, it dissipates as soon as you find out it's based on a lie. The thing I want you to understand is that's why the Bible shares a message of a loving God that included legal codes and standards of behavior, because it's rooted in truth and behavior. It's not just out there pie in the sky. God was feeling gushy about the people on the planet, so he came down and had a gush fest. Okay? He had standards, and it's all wrapped up in who he is. There's no biblical justification for the notion that the end justifies the means, ever. Ever. So you need to step back and understand. I suspect the boys took Dinah out of anger but killed everyone else out of the need to show ego and revenge. I think that they killed the people involved in it out of real anger over the situation. But what caused them to kill everybody else in town? They didn't rape. They didn't abduct. They just lived next to the guy who did. What are you killing them for? I think they were walking around thumping their chests like, me of Israel, you of the world. Okay, so everybody's lying on a hospital bed and you can come in and kill them, and you think that makes you tough, right? By the way, the same problem that Dinah had in the beginning of the story becomes they act out of a poor choice out of what they think is a good reason. That's exactly what verse 1 was in Dinah's life. These guys are duplicating her mistake. They're not fixing it. They're doing the same thing again. Now, when we come back, what we want to do is we want to take a break, and when we come back, I want to see the consequences of the story. What happens when the boys decide to take matters into their own hands and situationally derive their ethics? Let me suggest this. There is pain in your life, sometimes as a believer. Even though Jacob was changing and transforming, yet he was facing pain because his children were acting out. And probably the most painful thing in the life of a transformed believer is the loved ones around him don't get transformed just because he does. And that's really tough. That's why you make your choices very carefully as to who you're going to link your life together with, because you will be living through the horror of whatever mistakes they make, or the joys of whatever good choices they make. And that's why you have to look at it carefully. Okay?